This video is for section 7.7. Our objective in this section is to express square roots of negative numbers in terms of I. I is what's called the imaginary unit, and what I is it's the square root of negative 1. And we can also say that I squared equals negative 1. So we talked about earlier that when you take square roots of negative numbers, it's not a real number. There's no number that when you multiply it by itself, it equals negative 1. And so instead of having a real number equal to square root of negative 1, we use this imaginary unit I. So for example, if I want to look at the square root of negative 25, what I can do with that is I can separate, using the product rule, break this up into negative 1 times positive 25. Negative 1 times 25 is negative 25. And then, again using the product rule, I can break this up into separate square roots. So square root of negative 1 times the square root of 25. And the square root of negative 1, we replace that with the I. The square root of 25 is positive 5, and so this is equal to 5I. We treat I as a variable in terms of writing it after numbers, so you kind of could think of the 5 as like a coefficient. The I comes after the number. So in general, if I have the square root of a negative number, so square root of negative b, what I'm going to do is I'm going to separate that just like we did above into negative 1 times b, and then separate square root of negative 1 times square root of b, and so this is going to equal I times square root of b. Again, replace square root of negative 1 with the I. So if I'm writing the I with something that's still under a square root symbol, like here, then we generally write the I in front of the root. So we're going to look at example 1. It says to write as a multiple of I, or write using I. And then there's parts A, B, and C. So we're going to start with part A. This is square root of negative 9. So using the same process that I just did, I'm going to separate this into square root of negative 1 times 9. I'm writing this out with a lot of steps. Obviously, you can kind of do some of these in your head, but I want to make sure that it's clear what we're doing and why this is working the way that it does. So square root of negative 1 times square root of 9 is going to be I times 3, or 3I. Part B is square root of negative 3. So this one, unlike part A, is not a perfect square. So we're going to have negative 1 times 3. Break that up into separate square roots. Square root of negative 1 is I. Square root of 3, nothing I can do to simplify that, so I'm just going to leave that as square root of 3. So this is going to be I, and again we write the I in front if there's a root, I times square root of 3. C is square root of negative 80. This is also not a perfect square, so I'm going to write this as negative 1 times 80. And separate that into square root of negative 1 times the square root of 80. Now, square root of 80, I can simplify that square root. Even though it's not a perfect square, if I go to my list of perfect squares and start dividing it, I'll find that it's divisible by a perfect square. So for these problems in MyMathLab, if you don't simplify any square roots that can be simplified, then MyMathLab is going to mark them wrong. So I'm going to replace the square root of negative 1 with I. And then I'm also going to think about what can 80 be divided by that's a perfect square. And if I go down the list, the largest one is going to be 16. So I can break that up into square root of 16 times 5. And then I can separate the square roots here. Obviously, you don't need to write it out quite this many times, but just to kind of be clear about what's going on. I don't want to skip any steps. So this is going to give me I. Square root of 16 is 4. And then square root of 5, not a perfect square. Now, when we have this situation where we have a simplified square root, what we do is we write the I between the number and the root. So it's going to be 4I square root of 5. Just like that. So that's the answer. So what you should do next is checkpoint problem number 1. Do these in your notes, check your answers with the notes that are posted, and then move on to the homework.